I think the biggest request I've gotten from you all year, because a lot of you have been following from the spring when I started planting things and bringing all these plants I save outdoors, and you're always wondering how I keep them. So I'm gonna show you the really ugly part of how I keep them. Because guys, this is not a good greenhouse. This is not a professional greenhouse. This is actually a very old, ugly building that we used to have pigs in when I was little on the farm. It's nothing pretty. You know what? That's what it is, but it is a makeshift room that I use to keep my plants. So come on in and let's see the ugly, but let's also see what I do and how I save them. Welcome to the jungle. You know, sometimes you cannot have the big, beautiful greenhouse. That is like on my bucket list someday, that'd be wonderful. But how this started was like, well, probably 8 years ago now. I needed a space to start keeping some of the large plants that were doing well and that I was growing, running out of space in the house, because can you imagine bringing all these in? And trying to have an area that you can keep the conditions somewhat. Kip is of course in here too. We kind of like to come here when it starts getting cold out because you get a little bit of that green. So like I said, this is not an ideal greenhouse where you can completely control the humidity, the temperature perfectly, the sunlight perfectly. Instead, this is makeshift. So I always start by having grow lights, as many as I can. These are very strong LED grow lights. They work really well in the sense that they just give me a lot of good light over certain areas. So directly under them, I try to put the plants that need it most. So here I'm trying to take these citrus and I've been working them up more into a tree. And so things like that definitely need the light. So I try to categorize things as high need versus moderate and low. I put in the windows that you see. There weren't really any windows in here. It is not perfect sunlight, but it adds just more sunlight. And again, in front of the windows, things like the citrus or the agave and aloe that we'll get to later. So it kind of can give as much light as they can have from the windows that we have, because there's no windows above. This is just what it's gonna be. So a lot of the questions you guys have been asking are, how do you heat it? So for my heat, it is, guys, it is nothing fancy at all. This is just real life here. Okay, I don't have one of those like secret online like blogger like beautiful spaces. No, this is like ugly. So I use radiant heat. They're just like space heaters. And the reason I like radiant ones is they don't let out a lot of dry air as they're moving it out, and that would really affect and dry plants out quicker. They're just radiant, so they radiate that hot air off, and that helps heat this room somewhat better. So I'm not getting as much dry air as you would with like a space heater that pushes out air, and they're slightly more safe, so I feel more comfortable with them. You can set the temperature on them. I still check it all the time. So one thing that an actual greenhouse would wanna know is humidity level, the temperature, and be really exact on what they're keeping. You know, probably over 60% humidity for sure. I'm like right now in the 40s out here because it was still somewhat cool. It's obviously somewhat dry. So you can try to work with that. You could spray your plants daily with water when it gets really dry like that. And I sometimes will work with that. I also am just one of those people that, you know, this is going kind of just as best as it can. And I don't always focus too much on those details. If you have a beautiful greenhouse and it's bigger and you can focus on those and use the different mechanisms it has to do that, that's great. This just gives me a gauge and I can say, you know what? I probably need to start spraying some of my plants with a water bottle. That will just kind of be a good home remedy to do things like that. As far as temperature, obviously my thing is just to keep it obviously warm enough that they still are thriving, which is gonna be, for a greenhouse, around 80 degrees. I keep mine more in like the 60 to 80 degree. On a nice warm day, it could get up close to 80. Otherwise, it's usually more in that like 65 to 70 range. Again, you have to kind of do what works for you. With these heaters, it's definitely easy to keep it heated. I just don't let it get necessarily too hot because some of the others don't need that. So for me, it's a lot of these tropicals that I'm saving and I'm putting them under lights, like my big birds of paradise. You probably saw these on my front porch over the winter. A lot of you want to know, what do you do when you bring them in? So insects, we're all worried about insects. So on a lot of these plants, what I'll do is line them up outside. I will take a garden hose with a hard pressure, even if it's just with my thumb, and wash off as much as I can, because any, you know, bugs that could be on there, that will help get them off. The next thing I would do is some neem oil or even a spinosad spray, and that's just gonna help also kind of kill off any of the bugs that could be on it that you're bringing in. So those are just a couple things that I do to try to ensure that when I bring them in, they don't have bugs. And I do that a couple days before, let them acclimate after it's done, and hopefully get those off before I bring them in. Let's move on to the other side. So on this side, it's not that there's really a way that's better per side. It's more I kind of put the larger stuff, it seems like, on that side, some of the smaller stuff on this side. For watering, there is not a secret, guys. I am watering with a watering can because that's what I have and that's what works well. So the best way to decide, and I think this is true for most houseplants, when things are indoors, when they are inside your house, they usually need less water than they do outside. You're not having the elements dry them out. You're not having things, get the winds that they would have. So I like them to dry out completely and not keep things wet. Most houseplants, most containerized plants that we have indoors do not like to stay wet. That's where you get the root rot. That's also where you can get mildew on them, or those little flies and gnats that fly around them, fungus gnats. That's all because things are usually kept too wet. So it's better to keep them on the slight dry side. There's a few plants that you may have that could be slightly different. Certain ferns like to be a little bit more moist, obviously. The staghorn ferns like to be moist, but it's just something to watch. And that again is affected by your humidity level. If you're way too humid, which I don't have a problem with here in the winter, but if you are, you could get more mildew on plants, and that would be kind of, it's too much moisture in the air, so it's gonna be hard on those plants. And again, if you're too dry, they can dry out quicker and not actually get the nutrients they need. So I am watering them by hand. I check them, not quite daily, maybe about every other day, and I'm just able to keep a gauge. As for fertilizing, anything indoors, especially over the winter, I think of as a dormant period for it. So I'm probably only fertilizing it about once a month, and usually it's about half the ratio I would during the growing months outside. And it's just a 10-10-10 all-purpose fertilizer. Any of the brands that you know, whether it's Miracle-Gro, Jax, any of those you can use. And they kind of go well for any of these plants because you're doing it at a half rate, only about once a month. They're kind of dormant. So a lot of you are like, well, how do I know what I can bring in? And you were asking specific questions about geraniums, begonias, whatever they are, which actually neither of those I really keep a lot of. But anything that doesn't do well in your climate outside, know your growing zone. I'm zone 5B. I sometimes say I'm zone 4 because the winters can be harsh. But if they don't do well in your growing zone, when it gets cold, that means you have to bring them in. So any of the tropicals, gardenias, the echeverias, the aloes, none of these would actually thrive outside. So I have to bring them all in. And as you can tell, I really pack them in. A lot of these, like the agave, are pups that I take from others. And so a lot of these small ones I've been keeping getting bigger. When an agave, no, this is just something I found. When an agave gets good size, like some of the ones I keep in large urns outside, I'm actually able to keep them more around 40 degrees. And I put them on the other side. This plant room is just kind of an empty, gross room. And I keep a lot of my large agave over there, and they kind of just go dormant. They don't really need a lot of watering. I don't even hardly water them once a month. Same with my figs. It's kind of darker over there, no grow lights, it's colder. They just go dormant, and that works. Smaller plants, it can be harder to go dormant because they don't have a lot of roots to go on. So they definitely need a little bit more care, more moisture, because otherwise they'll just shrivel up and die. So I'm coming in here, I'm checking those things and I'm watching them, but like you can tell, since it's not an actual greenhouse, it doesn't have near the mechanisms and it isn't near as hard and picky as one would be. If it gets really stagnant in here or if I need airflow, I open the windows. I do have a small just indoor fan that I'll turn on too, just to create that airflow. That's good for plants. So again, with humidity levels or just with any diseases, a stagnant air can kind of harbor those. So if it's a nice day outside, I can open the windows. There's kind of a cross breeze that comes through. It just kind of helps that. And also some nice breezes for plants in general are good. It can actually create a stronger plant when you have a breeze. Kind of like when you have a small seedling starting, same thing. So that's kind of the overall process. It is nothing magical in here. It's nothing beautiful, but guess what? It's beautiful in the sense that it works. And sometimes us at-home gardeners, what do we have to do? We have to make it work. And since I want to keep so many plants, I am making this work. And it has been working now for like I said, 6-8 years. I've been able to bring plants in, they're getting bigger. A lot of them, that's why it's getting so full, is they have started to grow larger or I split them off and have multiple plants. So as you can tell, you can do this in a basement, you can do this in a garage if you can keep it warm enough. You can do this in a lot of spaces that you wouldn't think it would work, and it will work. You gotta do what you gotta do. So I hope this helps. I know I won't answer all your questions, but guess what? We can never answer all of our questions. And since it isn't a greenhouse, there's no secret other than some lights, some heat, and some water. So I hope you see that keeping some plants over can be easy. It can work and you can do it. we can just all save some plants and all have the same problem where we create little indoor jungle. It's a good problem to have. There could be a lot worse ones, like our closets. We're not gonna talk about that, but hope this helps. We'll keep on keeping on.